If we know one thing about business, and boy do we know a lot when we got legally served for our brand name, it's that creating something that people like will result in a requirement to make lots more of that thing, with franchises such as Call of Duty and FIFA churning out titles year in, year out. You'd think then that creating a new IP that's well received by both critics and players would mean sequels out the wazoo, but that isn't always the case. From legal disputes and studio closures to poor commercial figures and general lack of developer interest, there's a plethora of reasons as to why that great little standalone game you loved so much has never gotten a second outing. For this list, we're taking a look at titles that wowed audiences either upon their release or in the years since, but that unfortunately failed to spawn a series. If you're watching this video in the future and one of these games has since received a follow-up, then hooray for you! Sadly, we're not soothsayers though, so just bear in mind that everything from here on out is accurate at time of recording. So, with all that out the way, I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are 10 great games that never got a sequel. Number 10. The Simpsons Hit and Run. Oftentimes, mashing together two or more popular ideas has disastrous results, and for every Super Smash Bros, there are scores of crossovers that should never have existed in the first place. With that said, the follow-up to the hugely popular road rage, The Simpsons Hit and Run, could have been a disaster, the premise being that all of our favourite Springfield residents would be thrown into a Grand Theft Auto-style sandbox setting and tasked with creating as much chaos as possible. After the new and improved Buzz Cola turns out to be an alien substance intended to control the minds of those who consume it, it's up to Homer, Marge, and the rest of the gang to put a stop to the dastardly plan. Despite heavily satirizing Rockstar's gritty franchise, both GTA and Simpsons fans found the game to be wildly entertaining, with players racking up dozens of hours driving around Springfield and causing utter carnage. Though developer Radical Entertainment did make a start on a sequel to Hit and Run, the project was cancelled after EA gained the exclusive rights to producing Simpsons games. Although the giant corporation has produced a handful of games since, they've mostly been microtransaction-riddled mobile games that have never lived up to the brilliance of Radical's title. Number 9. Shadow of the Colossus. Upon its release back in 2005, Shadow of the Colossus was effectively heralded as a gift from the gods by everyone who came into contact with it. The game was praised for its visuals and soundtrack, as well as its rich narrative that weaves the story of Wanda, a heartbroken young chap that's willing to do anything, including slaying giant ancient beasts, to save his lady love, Mono. In 2018, the game was successfully remade for the PlayStation 4, with developer Bluepoint taking over the reins from Team Eco and managing to preserve the spirit of the original whilst updating the graphics, performance and controls for a more modern audience. Even though the original won a number of awards and was cited as the influence for everything from God of War 2 to the filmmaking of Guillermo del Toro, Shadow of the Colossus has never received a sequel, with 2016's The Last Guardian being about as close to a spiritual successor as we're likely to see. Director and lead designer Fumito Ueda has confirmed that he and his company are working on a brand new game which will be similar in scope to Shadow, so fans of its atmosphere and art style will at least get their Colossus itch partially scratched. Number 8. Grim Fandango. While many of us don't like to dwell too much on what lies beyond the grave, some people don't mind the thought, and even seek out video games that explore what happens when we shuffle off our mortal coil. We've literally just done a list all about that. One such title, on that list in fact, is LucasArts' 1998 adventure, Grim Fandango, an epic tale of crime and corruption, heavily influenced by the Aztec beliefs surrounding the afterlife. Upon its release, the game was applauded by both critics and players, both of whom fell in love with its unique art style, engaging narrative, and sense of humour that played on both the dark and the light. Although our hero Manny gets his story wrapped up rather nicely, players felt that the universe had many more departed souls whose tales they'd like to hear. Alas, director Tim Schafer has gone on record to say that in an ideal world he'd love to develop a sequel to Grim Fandango, but being just one man, he'd far sooner focus on new projects rather than keep going back to old ones. He has said, however, that if he were to go back to the property, he'd want to make it a full-blown open world. Although this probably does mean we may not see any new stories from the Land of the Dead in the short term, the game was remastered in 2015, so at least there's that, I suppose. Number 7. Eternal Darkness: SANITYS REQUIEM. Of all the publishers likely to release a successful console-exclusive survival horror title, Nintendo wouldn't be the one we'd put our money on. But back in 2002, they proved us wrong with psychological spookum Eternal Darkness: SANITYS REQUIEM. The narrative of the game follows Alex, a college student who returns to her grandfather's mansion to find him murdered, and discovers that a demonic book called The Tome of Eternal Darkness has something to do with the whole affair. Featuring some similar gameplay mechanics to the likes of Resident Evil, while employing unique features such as sanity effects, the game quickly earned its place in the horror gaming big leagues. Although the game was a hit with players and won a number of awards, it wasn't a commercial success, so Nintendo refused to support a sequel. The game's writer, Dennis Dyack, did make attempts to crowdfund a spiritual successor, but failed to raise the necessary funds, and when the developer, Silicon Knights, filed for bankruptcy in 2014, it was more or less the final nail in the Eternal Darkness coffin. Nintendo does continue, however, to renew the Eternal Darkness trademark, so perhaps there is light at the end of the tunnel after all. Number 6. Jade Empire. There are some who say that when it comes to console exclusives, Sony not only has the better hand, and Microsoft might as well not even be playing the game. And those people are, well, not entirely wrong, but even though Xbox exclusives aren't generally as good as those offered by PlayStation, there are a few gems hidden amongst the likes of Bomberman Act Zero, and one such shiny is the 2005 RPG Jade Empire. Heavily inspired by Chinese mythology, Jade Empire puts players in the shoes of the last surviving spirit monk, set on a quest to defeat the forces of the corrupt emperor and save their tutor, Master Li. Utilizing the morality system from Knights of the Old Republic, players were able to make dialogue choices during conversations that would impact the gameplay in various ways. The game was positively received and did alright sales-wise, but BioWare have never gone back to Jade Empire for a sequel. This isn't for lack of trying on the part of various developers, as a number of them have attempted to revive the IP over the years, but sadly nothing has ever come to fruition. Execs have said that they'd love to return to Jade Empire, but that's all well and good until you remember that they still haven't put anyone to work on the thing. It's not going to make itself. Number 5. Bully. It's fair to say that no one really expected much from Bully before its 2006 release. Although Rockstar had of course proven itself a competent developer with the GTA series, Bully was, somewhat ironically, tormented by various groups prior to launch, each of whom were calling for it to be banned and censored, despite none of them actually knowing what the game entailed. As such, when Bully ended up being a huge success, a good number of people were forced to eat their words. Controlling the delinquent Jimmy Hopkins, it's up to players to work their way through the ranks of fictional school Bulworth Academy in order to become popular enough to put an end to the school's bullying problem. As though to laugh in the face of its naysayers, Bully performed well both critically and commercially, leading pretty much everyone to question if a sequel was in the works. The answer? Well, maybe one day, but certainly not right now. Allegedly, Rockstar had been working on a sequel for around 18 months back in the early 2010s, but the project was canned due to a general lack of studio interest. Oh, sounds to me like they just need relieving of their lunch money. Number 4. Alan Wake. If there's one title out there that perfectly sets itself up for a sequel, it's 2010's Alan Wake. The game itself was set out like a TV series, with the levels broken down into episodes, and the entire thing was left on a cliffhanger, with players never actually finding out what happens to Alan. Inspired heavily by the works of Stephen King and paying homage to a number of TV shows, films, and books, the story follows author Alan Wake as he tries to solve the mystery behind his wife's mysterious disappearance. The game was favourably received, and with the titular character's fate uncertain, players were left wondering if it would get a sequel, as it was clear the developers had intended for that to be the case. Remedy Entertainment creative director Sam Lake even went on record to say that a series had been planned from the get-go, and that the team even had the story and characters all mapped out. Remedy had even pulled together a prototype in an attempt to secure a publisher, but unfortunately no one took the bait, and the developer ended up moving on to Quantum Break instead. You could say that publishers need to wake up and smell the opportunity. I'll see myself out. Number 3. Sleeping Dogs. Those unfamiliar with the action-adventure title by United Front's games Sleeping Dogs could be forgiven for thinking it's some sort of Animal Crossing spin-off, but they won't find any snoozing good boys here. Instead, they'll be stumbling into a world of corruption and wrongdoing. Originally intended to be a new entry in the true crime franchise, Sleeping Dogs came into existence after the sequel was cancelled. Square Enix ended up buying the publishing rights, renaming the game due to a lack of interest in true crime licensing, and releasing it as more of a spiritual successor. Players follow the story of Wei Shen, an undercover cop who must use all of the weapons, gadgets, and parkour abilities in his arsenal to infiltrate the dastardly Sunan Yi Triad organization. In spite of the fact that Sleeping Dogs sold close to 2 million copies, Square Enix branded it a flop, and though United Front came up with a number of prototypes for a sequel, the publisher was seemingly only interested in throwing money into Hitman and Tomb Raider. They did ask the devs if they would be willing to make a Sleeping Dogs mobile game, but neither they, nor, more importantly, the players, were particularly interested. Sadly, it looks like this is one sleeping dog we're going to have to let lie. Number 2. LA Noire. Fans of oldie-timey detective dramas were absolutely elated back in 2011 when Rockstar released their cop thriller LA Noire. Set in the 1940s, the game introduced players to Cole Phelps, World War II veteran and LAPD detective, on the trail of the city's most notorious criminals. Beginning each segment with a fresh crime scene, players would need to search for evidence, question witnesses, and use all of their deduction skills to figure out who done it. Though Cole's story is packaged off nicely, the mechanics of the game are just screaming out for a brand new narrative. Whether it's set in the same time frame and location or not, we're just desperate to get back to some hard doubting. Despite the developer stating that LA Noire is very important to the company, there seems to be no sign of a sequel to the game, with the developer seemingly intent on bringing Grand Theft Auto 5 to every device that Skyrim is available on, and GTA Online continuing to line their pockets nicely. That doesn't look set to change in the near future. Still, at least it won't be long until you're able to play GTA 5 on your Alexa. And number 1, Bloodborne. It's starting to feel like From Software isn't willing to allow us gamers too much of a good thing. Although 2011's Dark Souls managed to spawn 2 sequels, several of the developer's other IPs don't seem likely to get a follow-up anytime before hell freezes over. Inspired by the literary works of the likes of H.P. Lovecraft and Bram Stoker, Bloodborne wowed players upon its release with its gothic tale of plagues, beasts, and mysterious cosmic beings. Like its Souls cousins before it, Bloodborne is a devilishly tricky game to master, but that, along with its Lovecraftian themes and darkly beautiful world design, was at the heart of its appeal. Players itching to delve further into the world of Bloodborne can do so through a plethora of tie-in media, including a board game and comic books, but unfortunately, a follow-up video game has never materialised. There have of course been rumours of a sequel, however, these have so far been debunked by From Software, who, at the time of recording, are focusing on the new Souls-like IP, Elden Ring. This is great news, of course, for fans of Bloodborne's gameplay mechanics, but for those looking to re-immerse themselves in the city of Yharnam itself, we don't recommend holding your breath for a sequel. Otherwise, well, you might die before Elden Ring comes out. Don't do that.